The morning I discovered that 96 homes had been built on my family's ancestral land without permission was the morning that changed everything. A crisp October dawn when the mist still clung to the valleys and the sun had barely crested the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that should have been beautiful but instead served as the backdrop to the most devastating discovery of my entire life. My name is Jonathan Mitchell, and this is the story of how a ruthless development corporation thought they could steal 300 acres of prime real estate that had belonged to my family for 6 generations. How they conspired with corrupt officials and forged documents to build an entire residential community on land they had no right to touch, and how I spent 3 years of my life, every penny of my savings, and nearly my sanity itself to bring them to justice with nothing more than a single piece of paper. An original deed from 1847 that proved beyond any shadow of doubt that the land was mine, had always been mine, and would forever remain mine, regardless of how many millions of dollars they had invested in their illegal development scheme. It started innocuously enough, as most disasters do, with a phone call from my cousin Rebecca, who still lived in Millbrook County where I'd grown up, where my great-great-great-grandfather Samuel Mitchell had first claimed and settled the land after emigrating from Ireland during the potato famine, building a small farmhouse with his own hands and slowly, year by year, acquiring adjacent parcels until he'd assembled a substantial holding that he passed down to his son Thomas, who expanded it further and passed it to his daughter Margaret, who married a man named Robert Sterling but kept the Mitchell name on all the property documents, and so it continued through the generations until it came to my father, William Mitchell, who had worked that land his entire life, raising cattle and growing corn and maintaining the old homestead even as the world modernized around him, even as the nearby town of Millbrook transformed from a sleepy agricultural community into a bustling suburban satellite of the growing metropolis 30 miles to the east. I'd moved away 15 years earlier, chasing opportunities in the city, building a career in commercial architecture that kept me busy and financially comfortable but disconnected from my roots, visiting home only for holidays and special occasions, watching my father grow older and slower, his hands more gnarled with arthritis, his face more lined with the accumulated weather of 73 years, until finally he passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold February night, leaving me as the sole inheritor of the Mitchell property since my mother had died a decade earlier and I was an only child with no siblings to dispute the inheritance. The funeral was small and dignified, attended by the handful of people who still remembered the old ways, who still valued the connection between a man and his land, and afterward I'd met with my father's attorney, a kind elderly gentleman named Horace Patterson who had handled the Mitchell family's legal affairs for 40 years, and he'd given me a thick folder containing all the property deeds, tax records, survey maps, and other documents pertaining to the estate, which I'd taken back to my apartment in the city, with every intention of reviewing them carefully and deciding what to do with the property, whether to sell it or lease it or perhaps even return someday and restore the old farmhouse and live out my later years in the place where I'd been born. But life intervened as it always does. Work became hectic with a major project that demanded 16-hour days and complete focus, and the folder sat untouched on my shelf for months, the land sitting vacant and unused except for the property management company I'd hired to keep the taxes paid and the buildings maintained and the fences in good repair, a decision that would later prove to be both a blessing and a curse, because while they kept the property from falling into complete disrepair, they also failed to notice what was happening on the eastern section of the holding, failed to catch the initial surveying and preparation work that should have raised immediate red flags, failed to alert me until it was far, far too late to stop the disaster before it began. Rebecca's call came on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice tight with anxiety and confusion, telling me that she'd driven past the old Mitchell property over the weekend and had seen something very strange, heavy equipment and construction crews working on what appeared to be a large residential development right in the middle of where our land should be. And at first I'd dismissed her concerns, assuming that the development must be on adjacent property, that perhaps old man Hendricks had finally sold his farm, or that the Peterson family had decided to cash in on the suburban sprawl that was gradually consuming all the open land in the county. But Rebecca was insistent, saying she'd checked the location carefully, that she was certain the construction was happening on Mitchell land, and reluctantly I'd promised to look into it, making a note to call the property management company the next day and ask them what they knew about any development activity near the property. Still not particularly worried because I trusted Horace Patterson's work, trusted that all the legal protections were in place, trusted that no one could simply build on someone else's land without permission in modern America, where property rights were supposedly sacred and inviolable. The property manager, a hurried-sounding woman named Sarah Chen, was completely blindsided by my inquiry, claiming she'd heard nothing about any development, that the land was exactly as it should be, and she promised to send someone out to investigate and report back within 48 hours. A promise that turned into 3 days, then 4, then a week, with increasingly vague excuses about scheduling conflicts and difficulty accessing the property, until finally I'd had enough and booked a flight home to see for myself what was happening on the land that my family had held for nearly 2 centuries. The sight that greeted me when I arrived in Millbrook County was nothing short of apocalyptic, at least from my perspective as the rightful owner of the land that was being systematically transformed without my knowledge or consent, because what Rebecca had described as a development was actually far more advanced than I'd imagined, already showing the foundations of dozens of homes arranged in neat rows along freshly paved streets, with water and sewer lines being installed, electrical infrastructure being erected, and crews of workers swarming over the site like ants on a sugar cube, all of them employed by a company called Meridian Heights Development Corporation, according to the signs posted at the entrance to what they were calling Whispering Oaks Estates, a name that made me want to vomit given that there wasn't a single oak tree, whispering or otherwise, within half a mile of the construction site, since they'd clear-cut everything to make room for their cookie-cutter suburban nightmare. I'd pulled my rental car to the side of the access road and just sat there for 20 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my mind racing through the implications of what I was seeing, trying to understand how this could possibly be legal, how anyone could have approved permits for this massive project on private property without the owner's permission. And as the shock began to wear off and anger started to take its place, I'd driven to the construction trailer that served as the on-site office and demanded to speak with whoever was in charge, only to be met by a dismissive supervisor named Gary who looked at me like I was a crazy person when I tried to explain that this was my family's land and that they had no right to be building anything here. Gary had laughed, actually laughed in my face, and told me I was mistaken, that Meridian Heights had purchased this property fair and square from the county through a tax foreclosure sale, that all the legal paperwork was in perfect order, and that I should take my complaints to the county assessor's office if I had a problem with it, but that I needed to leave the construction site immediately or he'd call security and have me removed forcibly, which was when I realized that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or bureaucratic mistake, but rather something far more sinister, a deliberate theft orchestrated by people who thought they could get away with it, because they had money and connections and assumed that I would either not notice or not care enough to fight back. I'd driven straight to the county courthouse, a stately Victorian building that had stood in the center of Millbrook's town square since 1889, and demanded to see the assessor's records for the Mitchell property. And that's when the nightmare truly began to take shape, because according to the official county records, my family's land had been declared delinquent on property taxes 3 years earlier. Notices had supposedly been sent to the address on file. A foreclosure process had been initiated when no payment was received. And finally, the property had been auctioned off to satisfy the tax debt, with Meridian Heights Corporation being the successful bidder who paid $73,000 for 300 acres of prime developable land worth at least $50 million at current market rates, a sale so absurdly one-sided that it should have triggered immediate scrutiny from anyone with half a brain, and even a minimal sense of ethics. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold, as I stood in that musty records room reading through the documents. The clerk had pulled for me. The address where the tax notices had supposedly been sent wasn't my address, wasn't my father's address, wasn't any address that had ever been associated with the Mitchell family in the entire recorded history of our ownership, but rather was a post office box in a town 2 counties away, a box that had been opened just weeks before the first tax notice was sent, and that was registered to something called MMK Holdings LLC, a company I'd never heard of and that had no apparent connection to the Mitchell family whatsoever. I'd asked the clerk, a nervous young man who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with my questions, how the address on file had been changed, and he'd pulled up the digital record showing that a change of address form had been filed 18 months before my father's death, signed with what purported to be his signature, notarized by someone named Jennifer Blackwell, and processed without any verification or follow-up, despite the fact that my father had been receiving tax bills at his home address for over 50 years, and there was no logical reason why he would suddenly want them sent to a P.O. box in a town he'd probably never visited. The signature looked nothing like my father's actual signature, which I knew intimately because I'd watched him sign documents my entire life and had his signature on dozens of letters and cards he'd sent me over the years. And when I pointed this out to the clerk and suggested that perhaps someone should have noticed this obvious forgery, he'd merely shrugged and said that the office processed thousands of forms every year and couldn't be expected to verify every signature, which was apparently the official policy when it came to facilitating the largest property theft in the county's history. I'd demanded copies of everything, every document related to the tax foreclosure and subsequent sale, every permit that had been issued for the Whispering Oaks development, every communication between the county and Meridian Heights, and I'd spent the next 3 days camped out in a motel room going through hundreds of pages of paperwork, piecing together a conspiracy that went far deeper than I'd initially imagined, involving not just Meridian Heights, but also several county officials who seemed to have expedited the foreclosure process with unusual speed, waived normal notification requirements, and approved development permits in record time, despite numerous red flags that should have prompted additional investigation. The notary who supposedly witnessed my father's signature on the change of address form, Jennifer Blackwell, turned out to be the sister-in-law of Meridian Heights CEO, Marcus Sashford, a connection that was hardly coincidental. And when I tried to contact her to ask about the notarization, I discovered that she'd moved to Costa Rica 6 months earlier and had left no forwarding information, her notary license having been quietly revoked for unspecified violations shortly before her departure, violations that the state licensing board refused to discuss with me, despite my explaining that I was investigating potential fraud. Marcus Sashford himself was exactly the kind of predatory developer you'd expect to be behind such a scheme, a smooth-talking 50-something who'd made his fortune buying distressed properties, demolishing whatever stood on them and replacing them with the kind of cheap, mass-produced housing that was metastasizing across the American landscape like a cancer. Subdivisions with pretentious names like Autumn Ridge and Meadow, estates that contained neither ridges nor meadows but only endless rows of identical vinyl-sided boxes, separated by postage stamp yards and connected by streets that all looked exactly the same, so that pizza delivery drivers regularly got lost and residents sometimes came home drunk and walked into the wrong house without noticing. Meridian Heights had developed projects in 7 states, each one following the same playbook: identify undervalued land, acquire it through whatever means necessary, whether legitimate or otherwise, bulldoze everything, build as many units as possible as cheaply as possible, sell them to buyers who didn't know any better or couldn't afford anything better, and move on to the next project before the foundations started cracking and the roofs started leaking and the poorly installed plumbing started backing up, leaving behind communities that looked fine in the marketing brochures but that would age poorly and require constant expensive repairs that the homeowners couldn't afford, trapping them in depreciating assets that would become the slums of tomorrow. I'd hired an attorney, the best one I could afford given that I'd need to dedicate significant resources to this fight, a tough, experienced litigator named Sandra Michaels who specialized in property disputes and who'd earned a reputation for taking on big corporations and winning, though she'd warned me from the start that this would be an uphill battle because possession is not of the law, and Meridian Heights was already in possession of the property with what appeared on the surface to be legal authority, which meant that we'd need to prove not just that the foreclosure was improper but that it was fraudulent, which required a higher burden of proof and would likely take years to work through the court system. Sandra had filed an emergency injunction to stop construction while the ownership dispute was resolved, but the judge had denied it, ruling that Meridian Heights had relied in good faith on the county's foreclosure sale and shouldn't be penalized for what might turn out to be administrative errors. A decision that seemed to ignore the mountains of evidence, suggesting that this wasn't just an error but a deliberate scheme, and so the construction had continued even as we prepared our lawsuit, with more foundations poured, more framing erected, more infrastructure installed, until the development had progressed from 96 homes under construction to 96 homes completed and actually being sold to buyers who had no idea they were purchasing homes built on stolen land, buyers who were taking out mortgages and making down payments and dreaming of their futures in these houses that might ultimately be torn down if we prevailed in court, which added another layer of complexity and heartbreak to an already impossibly complicated situation. The discovery phase of the lawsuit took 18 months, during which Sandra's team of paralegals and investigators requested and reviewed thousands of documents, deposed dozens of witnesses, traced the corporate ownership structure of Meridian Heights and its various subsidiaries and shell companies, followed the money through multiple bank accounts and transactions, and gradually assembled a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had stolen not just my property, but dozens of other properties, across multiple states using variations of the same basic scheme: forge a change of address, let the tax notices pile up at the fake address, declare the property delinquent, rush through a foreclosure sale before anyone noticed, buy the property for pennies on the dollar through a front company that couldn't be easily traced back to Meridian Heights, and then develop it quickly before the rightful owners figured out what had happened, counting on the fact that most people lacked the resources or determination to fight back effectively, and that even those who did fight would likely give up when faced with years of expensive litigation and the overwhelming power imbalance between an individual property owner and a corporation with teams of lawyers and political connections and the ability to drag out proceedings indefinitely. But Sandra and I were not most people, and we refused to give up despite the financial strain that was draining my savings at an alarming rate, despite the emotional toll of watching my family's land being destroyed and transformed into something unrecognizable, despite the threatening letters from Meridian Heights, attorneys warning me about filing frivolous lawsuits and threatening to sue me for damages if I continued making what they called false accusations that were hurting their ability to sell homes and damaging their reputation, threats that were clearly meant to intimidate me into dropping the case, but that only strengthened my resolve because I knew that right was on my side even if the system seemed stacked against me. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, an elderly woman named Margaret Torres, who'd been a secretary in the county assessor's office for 35 years before retiring, who'd read about my case in the local newspaper and who'd reached out to Sandra's office to say that she remembered something odd about the Mitchell property file, something that had bothered her at the time but that she'd been told to ignore by her supervisor. A man named Dennis Keller, who'd been unusually interested in the Mitchell foreclosure, and who'd personally handled much of the paperwork himself rather than delegating it to staff as was normally done, and who'd told Margaret explicitly not to send any additional notifications to the old address on file, even though that was standard procedure for foreclosure cases, especially ones involving long-time property owners with clean payment histories who suddenly became delinquent, which should have triggered extra verification efforts rather than less. Margaret had retired shortly after the Mitchell foreclosure was finalized, and she'd later learned that Dennis Keller had also left the county assessor's office, taking a lucrative job with a land development consulting firm that turned out to be owned by a holding company that was itself owned by Marcus Ashford, a connection that was buried under multiple layers of corporate structures but that Sandra's investigators were able to trace through Secretary of State filings and tax records and corporate registration documents that revealed the intricate web of relationships binding together what should have been independent parties in an arms transaction. Armed with Margaret Torres's testimony and the documentary evidence of Dennis Keller's financial relationship with Marcus Ashford, Sandra filed an amended complaint that added charges of conspiracy, fraud, forgery, and civil RICO violations, allegations that raised the stakes considerably and that got the attention of the State Attorney General's office, which opened its own criminal investigation into Meridian Heights practices and began looking at not just my case but at other suspicious foreclosures and property acquisitions across the state, several of which showed similar patterns of forged documents, fake addresses, expedited foreclosures, and connections between county officials and development companies that suggested a systematic corruption of the property tax system for private profit. The media picked up the story, first the local papers, then regional news outlets, then finally national media once the scale of the alleged fraud became clear and reporters started finding other victims in other states who'd lost property to Meridian Heights using similar methods. Victims who'd either given up fighting or who'd accepted inadequate settlement offers rather than face years of expensive litigation. And suddenly Marcus Ashford was giving defensive interviews where he denied any wrongdoing and claimed that if there were any irregularities, they were the result of mistakes by county employees or contractors that Meridian Heights couldn't possibly have known about, that his company had acted in good faith at all times and had purchased the property through legitimate channels and shouldn't be held responsible for problems with the foreclosure process that weren't their fault. But the documentary evidence told a different story, particularly after Sandra's team obtained emails through discovery that showed Marcus Ashford had been in direct communication with Dennis Keller about the Mitchell property months before the foreclosure sale, discussing how to expedite the acquisition and minimize notification complications, language that was clearly code for how to steal the property without the owner finding out, and that showed payments from Meridian Heights subsidiaries to bank accounts controlled by Dennis Keller in amounts that far exceeded what anyone would pay for legitimate consulting services. Payments that looked an awful lot like bribes to facilitate property theft. The trial finally began 3 years after I'd first discovered the construction on my land. 3 years during which I'd spent every dollar of my inheritance fighting this battle. Had taken a leave of absence from my architecture job that had turned into permanent unemployment when the firm decided they couldn't hold my position any longer. Had moved back to Millbrook County to be closer to Sandra's office and the courthouse. Had lived in a tiny apartment and survived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches while watching Meridian Heights complete and sell all 96 homes in the Whispering Oaks development, generating tens of millions in revenue that they were using to fund their legal defense and to launch similar projects in other counties. Emboldened by the fact that they'd gotten away with it for so long and confident that they could continue to get away with it, because the system was designed to protect established economic interests rather than individual property rights. Because judges were reluctant to reverse completed real estate transactions even when they were tainted by fraud, and because they could afford to pay lawyers to tie up the proceedings indefinitely while their opponents exhausted their resources and their will to fight. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with Sandra methodically presenting document after document, witness after witness, building an overwhelming case that the foreclosure had been fraudulent from start to finish, that the change of address form had been forged, that the notary had been complicit in the fraud, that Dennis Keller had been bribed to expedite the foreclosure and suppress normal verification procedures, that Marcus Sashford had knowingly purchased property that he had reason to know was being stolen from its rightful owner, and that Meridian Heights had continued building even after being notified of my ownership claims because they calculated that it would be cheaper to fight me in court than to stop construction and lose their investment. Meridian Heights attorneys fought back with procedural objections, character attacks on our witnesses, alternative explanations for every piece of evidence, and above all with the argument that even if there had been problems with the foreclosure process, their client had relied in good faith on the county's sale and shouldn't lose millions of dollars in investment because of mistakes made by county employees, that the proper remedy was for me to sue the county for damages rather than to reverse the property transfer and invalidate all the subsequent home sales. That tearing down 96 homes where families were now living would be a disproportionate remedy that would harm innocent third parties who'd done nothing wrong. But then came the moment that changed everything. The moment when Sandra introduced into evidence the document that would prove to be the silver bullet that destroyed Meridian Heights' defense and vindicated my family's claim to the land, the original deed from 1847, signed by Samuel Mitchell, and recorded in the county land records when Millbrook County was still a frontier territory, before typewriters or carbon copies or digital records, when deeds were handwritten on heavy parchment paper and sealed with wax and stored in fireproof vaults because they were literally irreplaceable, and this deed, which had been sitting in that thick folder that Horace Patterson had given me after my father's funeral, which I'd barely glanced at during those hectic months when I was too busy with work to deal with estate matters. This deed contained something I hadn't noticed until Sandra's team had examined every document with forensic thoroughness, a surveyor's description of the property boundaries that didn't match the legal description in any of the subsequent deeds or tax records. The original 1847 deed described the property as extending from the old creek bed that had long since dried up to a line of marked oak trees that had been cut down during World War II, boundaries that made perfect sense in 1847 when the land was being divided up and settled, but that had become increasingly abstract as the landscape changed and as subsequent surveys used more precise measurements and modern reference points. And over the generations, the legal description of the Mitchell property had been updated and modernized with each new survey and each property transaction, translated from the creek to the oaks into township and range descriptions and eventually into GPS coordinates, a process that should have maintained the same boundaries but that had somehow, somewhere along the way, resulted in a legal description that was missing approximately 40 acres on the eastern edge of the property. 40 acres that included exactly the land where Whispering Oaks had been built. Sandra's expert surveyor, a meticulous professional named Dr. Raymond Chen, who'd been doing boundary surveys for 40 years and who treated his work with the reverence of a scholar translating ancient manuscripts, had spent weeks researching historical maps, old survey markers, geological records, and the evolution of the property boundaries over time, and he'd determined that the legal description used by the county in the tax foreclosure proceedings didn't actually describe the full extent of the Mitchell property as originally deeded. That somewhere in the chain of title updates, probably in the 1960s when the county modernized its record-keeping system and converted old meat sandbounds descriptions into the modern format, an error had been made that effectively removed 40 acres from the official property description, even though the Mitchell family had continued to pay taxes on and maintain possession of the entire parcel, including the disputed 40 acres, meaning that we had both legal title under the original deed and adverse possession through continuous use, which should have made our claim bulletproof, except that the county's records didn't reflect the reality on the ground. Dr. Chen had prepared elaborate exhibits showing the evolution of the property boundaries, overlaying historical maps with modern GPS surveys, demonstrating conclusively that the 40 acres where Whispering Oaks stood had been continuously part of the Mitchell property since 1847, that my ancestors had farmed that land and grazed cattle on it and maintained fences across it and paid taxes on it and never for one moment surrendered their claim to it, and that the error in the legal description used by the county was exactly that, an error that didn't negate the underlying reality of ownership as established by the original deed, which took precedence over all subsequent documents because it was the foundational document from which all other claims derived their legitimacy. Meridian Heights attorneys had objected strenuously, arguing that the original deed was too old and too vague to override modern legal descriptions, that you couldn't just pull out a document from 1847 and use it to invalidate property records that had been maintained and relied upon for decades, that allowing such a precedent would throw the entire property title system into chaos because anyone could dig up old deeds and claim that modern boundaries were wrong, and besides, they argued, even if there was a discrepancy in the legal description, the Mitchell family's failure to notice and correct it for all these years constituted a form of abandonment or at least negligence that should prevent us from now claiming ownership of land that the county had treated as separate from the main Mitchell parcel. But Sandra demolished these arguments one by one, pointing out that the original deed was a recorded legal document that had never been superseded or invalidated, that the subsequent descriptions were meant to describe the same property as the original deed rather than to create new boundaries, that mistakes in legal descriptions were common and well-established legal principles held that the true boundaries were those intended by the original grantor regardless of errors in subsequent descriptions, that the Mitchell family had never abandoned the 40 acres but had continuously used and maintained them as part of their farm, and most importantly, that Meridian Heights and its co-conspirators had deliberately exploited the error in the legal description to steal property they knew or should have known belonged to someone else, which meant they had unclean hands and couldn't rely on technical arguments about proper legal descriptions when they'd acquired the property through fraud. The judge, a stern woman named Judith Hawthorne, who'd been on the bench for 23 years and who had a reputation for being brilliant, meticulous, and completely impatient with anyone who tried to bullshit her, listened to 6 weeks of testimony and argument, reviewed hundreds of exhibits, read thousands of pages of briefs and legal memoranda, and then took 3 months to consider before issuing her ruling, a 78-page decision that methodically dismantled every aspect of Meridian Heights' case and found in my favor on every significant issue, determining that the foreclosure had been fraudulent and void, that I was the rightful owner of the entire property, including the 40 acres where Whispering Oaks stood, that Meridian Heights had knowingly participated in the fraud, and couldn't claim good faith when they'd ignored obvious red flags, that Dennis Keller and Jennifer Blackwell had engaged in criminal conspiracy to facilitate property theft, and that the original 1847 deed established boundaries that superseded the erroneous, modern legal description, meaning that every structure built on the property by Meridian Heights was built on land that never belonged to them and that they would need to be removed. The courtroom erupted when Judge Hawthorne announced her decision, with Marcus Nashford turning pale and his attorneys immediately announcing their intention to appeal, while I sat there in stunned silence trying to process what had just happened, that after 3 years of fighting I had actually won, that the system had actually worked despite all its flaws and delays and biases, that a single piece of paper from 1847 had proven more powerful than all of Meridian Heights' money and connections and political influence, that justice, while delayed, had not been denied. But Judge Hawthorne wasn't finished. because she then addressed the question of what remedy was appropriate given that 96 families were living in homes on the property, families who were innocent victims of Meridian Heights fraud, and who couldn't be thrown out of their homes without severe hardship, and she ordered that Meridian Heights would have to purchase the property from me at its current fair market value as improved property, which was valued at just over $50 million, and that they would also have to pay punitive damages of $30 million, attorney's fees and costs of approximately $4 million, and lost use damages calculated from the date they first began construction without permission, bringing the total judgment to something close to $90 million, a figure so large that it would effectively bankrupt Meridian Heights and destroy Marcus Ashford's business empire, which was exactly what they deserved for thinking they could steal my family's land and get away with it. Meridian Heights did appeal, of course, and the appeal dragged on for another 2 years, during which they were required to post a bond to ensure I could collect if I ultimately prevailed, and during which they tried every legal maneuver imaginable to reduce the judgment or delay payment. But the appellate court upheld Judge Hawthorne's decision in its entirety, finding that her interpretation of the law was correct and that the evidence clearly supported her factual findings. And when Meridian Heights tried to appeal to the state Supreme Court, that court declined to hear the case, letting the appellate decision stand and bringing the legal battle to a final conclusion 4.5 years after it had begun. The payment of the judgment took several more months to finalize as Meridian Heights was forced to liquidate assets and sell off other properties to raise the cash, and Marcus Ashford filed for personal bankruptcy, claiming that he'd personally guaranteed corporate debts and would be wiped out by the judgment, though Sandra's investigators found evidence that he'd hidden substantial assets overseas and in trusts controlled by family members, and she was pursuing those assets through separate proceedings that would likely continue for years. But that was no longer my primary concern because the main judgment had been paid, and I was suddenly, shockingly, improbably wealthy, holding a check for $90 million that represented not just compensation for what had been stolen but vindication for my family's legacy and proof that even the little guy could win if he was willing to fight hard enough and long enough and had right on his side. The story got extensive media coverage, with reporters treating it as a David versus Goliath tale and holding me up as an example of persistence and principle, though they tended to gloss over how close I'd come to losing everything. How many nights I'd lain awake wondering if I was being foolish, throwing away my career and my savings on what might turn out to be an unwinnable fight. How many times Sandra had warned me that we might lose despite the strength of our case, because juries and judges were unpredictable and big corporations had advantages that couldn't be quantified, and how much luck had been involved in finding witnesses like Margaret Torres and documents like the original 1847 deed that proved to be exactly what we needed exactly when we needed them. The families living in Whispering Oaks were understandably upset and confused about what the judgment meant for them, and I'd reached out through Sandra to assure them that they could continue living in their homes, that I had no intention of evicting anyone or tearing down the houses, that I understood they were innocent victims of Meridian Heights fraud just as I was, and that I would work with them to resolve the title issues and ensure that they had secure ownership of their properties, which ultimately meant selling the land back to them at reasonable prices that reflected what they'd already paid rather than trying to extract maximum value, because this had never been about money for me but about justice, and about preserving my family's legacy and teaching Marcus Ashford and people like him that they couldn't just steal whatever they wanted and rely on their wealth and power to protect them from consequences. Dennis Keller was prosecuted by the State Attorney General's office and ultimately pleaded guilty to bribery, fraud, and conspiracy charges, receiving a sentence of 8 years in federal prison and being ordered to forfeit all the money he'd received from Meridian Heights, while Jennifer Blackwell was arrested in Costa Rica and extradited back to the United States, where she faced similar charges and ultimately accepted a plea deal that gave her 5 years in exchange for her testimony against other co-conspirators. Marcus Ashford himself was indicted on multiple charges including fraud, forgery, and racketeering, and while his high-priced attorneys managed to get some of the charges dismissed, he was ultimately convicted on several counts and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, a sentence that seemed almost inadequate given the scope of his crimes, but that at least ensured he would spend a significant portion of his remaining years behind bars thinking about what he'd done and how his greed had destroyed not just his own life, but the lives of countless others who'd been victimized by his schemes. The investigation into Meridian Heights practices uncovered similar frauds in 6 other states, leading to additional criminal charges and civil lawsuits that would take years to fully resolve, but that had already resulted in the recovery of millions of dollars for victims and the reform of property tax foreclosure procedures in multiple jurisdictions to prevent future abuses. Reforms that included better verification of address changes, longer notification periods, more stringent review before foreclosures could proceed, and criminal background checks for notaries who would be handling property-related documents, changes that wouldn't bring back what had been lost, but that might prevent the next Marcus Ashford from destroying the next family's legacy. As for me, I used part of the judgment money to restore my father's old farmhouse to its former glory, not to live in but as a kind of museum and family archive where the Mitchell family story would be preserved for future generations, where the original 1847 deed would be displayed in a climate-controlled case along with photographs and documents and artifacts spanning nearly 2 centuries, telling the story of how one family had held onto their land through wars and depressions and changing times, and how that land had nearly been stolen but had ultimately been saved by persistence and principle and one very old piece of paper that proved more powerful than all the money and corruption that had been arrayed against it. I established a foundation to help other victims of property fraud and to provide legal assistance to people fighting to save their homes and land from predatory developers and corrupt officials, because I'd learned through my own experience how difficult it was to fight back even when you knew you were right, how the system was stacked in favor of those with resources and connections, and how many people gave up, not because their cases lacked merit, but because they lacked the money to hire competent attorneys and the stamina to endure years of litigation. And I wanted to use my unexpected wealth to level the playing field at least a little bit for the next person who found themselves in the situation I'd faced. Rebecca had stood by me throughout the entire ordeal, attending hearings, researching records, helping manage the media attention, and generally being the sister I'd never had. And when it was all over, I'd given her a substantial sum as thanks for her support, and for being the one who'd first noticed something was